Richmond Palace, on the banks of the Thames, in the cold and damp hours before dawn on March 24th, 1603. In a sumptuous room now filled with an oppressive silence and the bittersweet aroma of medicinal remedies, lies on her bed, or rather on a pile of cushions on the floor where she has insisted on spending her last agonizing hours, the woman who for almost half a century had ruled England with an iron fist and unparalleled political intelligence. Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, Gloriana, the last of the formidable Tudor dynasty, the sovereign who had defeated the Spanish Armada, consolidated the Anglican Reformation, and presided over a golden age of English culture, now faces, at the age of 69, her last and most relentless enemy, death. Her once vibrant and energetic body is now consumed by old age and a mysterious illness that plunges her into deep melancholy and almost complete silence. Her eyes, which had dazzled ambassadors, intimidated advisors, and seduced favorites, now wander aimlessly, perhaps contemplating the ghosts of a long and glorious reign, but also a lonely one full of sacrifice. What thoughts, what regrets, what fears assail the soul of this legendary queen in her final moments? Does she regret never having married, never having left a direct heir to her blood, thus opening the doors to a new Scottish dynasty? Is she haunted by the specters of those she had to send to the scaffold, including her cousin and rival, Mary Stuart, Queen of Scotland? Or does she cling, with the stubbornness that characterized her throughout her life, to the image of a strong, independent Protestant England, the great legacy of her reign? The agony of Elizabeth I was not only the end of an exceptional woman, it was the twilight of an era, the closing of a fundamental chapter in the history of England, and the beginning of a new era full of uncertainties. This is the chronicle of a lonely death, the story of the last days of a queen who married her kingdom, and at the end of her long life, found herself facing darkness without the company of a husband or the comfort of a child. Join me as I unravel the secrets of Elizabeth's death chamber, explore the ghosts that populated her twilight years, and reflect on the price of absolute power and virginity consecrated to the state. Was her end a peaceful liberation or a bitter realization of the loneliness of the throne? The answer, like so many others in the life of this enigmatic sovereign, lies hidden in the shadows of history and the whispers of a reign without inner peace. To fully understand the complex personality of Elizabeth I, the magnitude of her reign, and the significance of her lonely final agony, it is essential that we first immerse ourselves in 16th century England, a nation in the throes of transformation, torn by deep religious divisions, threatened by powerful external enemies, and in search of a national identity and a preeminent place on the European stage. Elizabeth was born on September 7, 1533, at Placentia Palace in Greenwich, in circumstances that would indelibly mark her life and character. She was the daughter of King Henry VIII and his second wife, Anne Boleyn. Her birth, far from being the long-awaited male heir that Henry so desired to secure the succession of the newly founded Tudor dynasty, was a profound disappointment to her father and a harbinger of the tragedy that loomed over her mother. When Elizabeth was just 2.5 years old, her mother, Anne Boleyn, was accused of adultery, incest, and treason, and executed in the Tower of London on the orders of Henry VIII. Shortly afterwards, Elizabeth was declared illegitimate by an Act of Parliament and removed from the line of succession, a stigma that would haunt her throughout much of her youth and forge in her a cunning, distrustful, and extraordinarily resilient character. Her childhood and adolescence were spent in an atmosphere of constant political and religious uncertainty, overshadowed by her father's successive wives and the changing factions at court. She received, however, a careful and exceptionally thorough education for a woman of her time, under the tutelage of some of the most eminent scholars of the day, such as Roger Ascham. She learned to speak and write fluently in several languages: Latin, Greek, French, Italian, in addition to her native English, studied history, rhetoric, theology, and music, and developed a sharp intelligence, a prodigious memory, and a love of knowledge that would accompany her throughout her life. During the brief reign of her Protestant half-brother, Edward VI, 1547 to 1553, son of Henry VIII and Jane Seymour, Elizabeth seemed to regain some stability and favor at court. However, the premature death of Edward and the subsequent accession to the throne of her older half-sister Mary the Run, 1553 to 1558, daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, plunged her once again into a situation of extreme danger. Mary, a devout Catholic and resentful of the humiliations she and her mother had suffered at the hands of the Reformation, set out to restore Catholicism in England by any means necessary, including a fierce persecution of Protestants, which earned her the nickname Bloody Mary. Elizabeth, who had been educated in the Protestant faith and who represented a potential threat to Mary's throne due to her popularity among the reformers, was viewed with deep suspicion by the Queen and her advisers. In 1554, following the rebellion of Sir Thomas Wyatt, who sought to prevent Mary's marriage to Philip II of Spain, and according to some, to place Elizabeth on the throne, the young princess was arrested and imprisoned for several weeks in the Tower of London, the very place where her mother had met her death. It was a period of enormous distress and fear for Elizabeth, who seriously feared for her life. Although she was eventually released due to lack of conclusive evidence of her involvement in the revolt, she lived the rest of Mary's reign under strict surveillance and in a constant state of alert, learning the difficult art of dissimulation, prudence, and political survival in a hostile environment. The death of Mary I, childless, in November 1558, finally opened the doors to the throne for Elizabeth. At the age of 25, she ascended to the throne of an England deeply divided by religion, with empty state coffers, threatened by foreign powers such as Spain and France, and with a rebellious nobility accustomed to factional struggles. Few expected that this young queen, whose legitimacy was still questioned by Catholics, who considered her the daughter of a null marriage and a heretic, would manage to remain in power for long. However, Elizabeth I would prove to possess a political intelligence, diplomatic astuteness, iron determination, and personal charisma that would surprise her contemporaries and make her one of the greatest and most successful monarchs in English history. Her long reign, which lasted almost 45 years, 1558 to 1603, would become known as the Elizabethan Golden Age, a period of cultural flourishing, with figures such as Shakespeare, Marlowe, and Spenser, maritime and commercial expansion, consolidation of English national identity, and the affirmation of England as a leading European power. One of the first and most important challenges Elizabeth had to face was the religious question. With extraordinary skill and pragmatism, she managed to establish a religious compromise, the so-called Elizabethan settlement, or Via Media, which attempted to reconcile the positions of Catholics and Protestants, although with a clear inclination toward moderate Protestantism. The Church of England, separated from Rome since the time of Henry VIII, was reaffirmed as the official church of the state, with the Queen as its supreme governor, but a liturgy and doctrine were adopted, which, although essentially Protestant, retained some elements of the Catholic tradition, in order to avoid too traumatic a break and to attract the loyalty of the majority of her subjects. However, this compromise did not satisfy the most recalcitrant Catholics, who continued to see Elizabeth as a usurper and a heretic, nor the most puritanical Protestants, who wanted a much more radical religious reform and a complete purification of any vestige of papism. Throughout her reign, Elizabeth had to contend with numerous Catholic conspiracies, often supported by Spain or the papacy, which sought to depose her and restore Catholicism in England, as well as growing pressure from the Puritans, who questioned her authority and demanded further reforms. Another major challenge of her reign was the question of her marriage and succession to the throne. From the moment she ascended the throne, her advisers in Parliament repeatedly urged her to marry and ensure the continuity of the Tudor dynasty through the birth of an heir. Numerous candidates were presented to her, both English and foreign, including her former brother-in-law, Philip II of Spain, and several French and German princes. Elizabeth, however, with calculated cunning and ambiguity, managed to evade all marriage commitments, using the prospect of her wedding as a diplomatic tool to maintain the balance between the European powers and to control the ambitions of her own nobles. She proclaimed herself the Virgin Queen, married only to her kingdom and her people, a powerful and charismatic image that helped forge her legend, but also left the pressing problem of succession unresolved. The main dynastic threat to Elizabeth came from her Catholic cousin, Mary Stuart, Queen of Scotland, who, as the granddaughter of Margaret Tudor, sister of Henry VIII, had strong claims to the English throne and was considered by many Catholics to be the legitimate sovereign of England. The presence of Mary Stuart in England, where she fled in 1568 after being deposed by Protestant Scottish nobles, became a constant source of conspiracy and instability for Elizabeth. A new enigma was emerging. How would Elizabeth handle this threat without provoking civil war or foreign intervention? And a symbolic object, the coronation ring that Elizabeth refused to remove until almost the moment of her death, symbolizing her marriage to England, would become an emblem of her complex and lonely relationship with power and her own destiny. The omens of a lonely end, though still distant, were already apparent in the Queen's refusal to share her throne and her life with a consort, a decision that, while politically astute in many ways, would condemn her to an old age without the companionship of a husband or the comfort of a child. The downward spiral that, in the last years of Elizabeth II's long and generally glorious reign, would take her from the height of her power and popularity to an old age marked by melancholy, isolation, and growing mistrust, was not so much an abrupt political or military decline, but rather a slow and progressive physical and emotional exhaustion, a gradual loss of the vitality and optimism that had characterized her heyday, and a growing awareness of her own mortality and the uncertainty surrounding the future of her kingdom without a direct heir to her bloodline. As the 16th century drew to a close and the 17th century dawned, the Virgin Queen, who had ruled England with a firm hand and consummate political astuteness for more than 4 decades, began to show obvious signs of aging and fatigue. Her legendary energy waned, her character, always strong and often temperamental, became more irritable and capricious, and her physical appearance, which she had carefully maintained throughout her life with elaborate dresses, wigs, and cosmetics, began to reveal the ravages of time and the concerns of state. One of the events that most contributed to darkening the last years of her reign and undermining her spirit was the execution of her cousin and rival, Mary, Queen of Scots, in 1587. Although Mary had been a constant focus of Catholic conspiracies against Elizabeth during the nearly 20 years she spent as a prisoner in England, and although her elimination was seen by many of Elizabeth's advisors as a political necessity to ensure the stability of the kingdom and the safety of the Queen, Elizabeth had always shown a deep reluctance to sign the death warrant of another anointed queen, aware of the gravity of the precedent it set, and perhaps also tormented by a certain sense of guilt or family responsibility. The final decision to execute Mary, taken after the discovery of the Babington plot, was a bitter pill for Elizabeth to swallow, a stain on her conscience that, according to some, haunted her until the end of her days. Another factor contributing to the deterioration of the Queen's mood was the gradual loss of many of her most loyal and experienced advisors and friends, those who had accompanied her since the beginning of her reign and had been the architects of her greatest successes. Men such as William Cecil, Lord Burghley, her chief minister and advisor for more than 40 years, and Sir Francis Walsingham, her efficient and feared head of espionage, died at the end of the 16th century, leaving a void that was difficult to fill and plunging the Queen into increasing loneliness. Her new favorites, such as the young and handsome Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, although initially enjoying royal favor, often lacked the prudence, loyalty, or ability of their predecessors, and their excessive ambitions and political mistakes caused serious problems for the Queen in her later years. The rebellion and subsequent execution of the Earl of Essex in 1601 for conspiring against the crown was a particularly painful episode for Elizabeth, who had felt a special, almost maternal affection for him and saw his betrayal as a new and bitter proof of human ingratitude and the loneliness of power. The wars in Ireland against the Catholic rebels, supported by Spain, also meant a constant drain on England's manpower and resources during the last years of Elizabeth's reign, and contributed to increasing discontent and fatigue in the country. Added to this were economic difficulties caused by poor harvests, inflation, and the cost of the wars, which affected the population and generated social tensions. On a personal level, old age and the prospect of death without a direct heir began to weigh increasingly heavily on Elizabeth's mind. Her famous refusal to marry, which in her youth had been a clever political strategy, now became a source of anguish and uncertainty for the future of the kingdom. Although she had managed to keep the ambitions of her potential successors at bay and had avoided formally naming an heir so as not to weaken her own authority, the question of who would succeed her to the throne was a matter of constant concern and intense speculation at court and throughout Europe. The most likely candidate, and the one who would eventually succeed her, was James VI of Scotland, son of Mary Stuart, a Protestant who offered the prospect of a peaceful union of the crowns of England and Scotland. Elizabeth, although she never officially named him her heir until she was on her deathbed, maintained a secret and ambiguous correspondence with him during her last years, preparing the ground for a transition that, although not desired by her in her heart of hearts, as it meant the end of the Tudor dynasty and the rise of the Stuarts, seemed inevitable and politically expedient. The deterioration of her health in the early months of 1603 was gradual but inexorable. At the end of February, the Queen, then aged 69, fell ill at her palace in Richmond. What at first seemed like a simple cold or a passing indisposition soon turned into a more serious illness, characterized by deep melancholy, loss of appetite, persistent insomnia, and increasing physical weakness. Elizabeth refused to stay in bed, take medicine, or receive visits from doctors, displaying a stubbornness and distrust that drove her advisors and ladies-in-waiting to despair. She spent hours sitting on cushions on the floor, silent, staring into space, as if lost in dark thoughts or tormented by ghosts from the past. She is said to have complained of strange dreams and visions, and to have occasionally spoken to herself or addressed absent figures. This erratic and melancholic behavior fueled rumors of a possible deterioration of her mental faculties, although it is more likely that it was the result of deep depression, extreme physical and emotional exhaustion, and an awareness of her own impending death. Paranoia, which had always been a latent trait in her character, forged in years of conspiracies and danger, seemed to intensify in her final days. She distrusted everyone, refused to name her successor for fear of being abandoned or assassinated, and clung desperately to the life and power she had worked so hard to achieve and maintain. The downward spiral had closed in on the once invincible Virgin Queen. The internal hook for this deterioration could be the description of a particularly distressing sleepless night, or an encounter with one of her advisors, in which she refused to make a crucial decision about the succession, increasing tension and uncertainty at court. The partial revelation of her fragility, of her suffering humanity, contrasted brutally with the image of power and majesty she had projected throughout her reign. The shadow of the executioner, that figure Elizabeth I had invoked so often and so coldly for her enemies throughout her long and often ruthless reign, now loomed, albeit in a more subtle and natural form, over her own declining existence. The deterioration of her health, both physical and mental, became increasingly evident and alarming in the first weeks of March 1603, plunging the English court into a state of deep anxiety, contained expectation, and hidden intrigues over the succession. The Queen, who throughout her life had enjoyed a remarkably robust physical constitution and almost inexhaustible energy, was now bedridden, consumed by an illness that the doctors of the time, with their limited knowledge, were unable to diagnose with certainty, let alone treat effectively. The descriptions that have come down to us of her condition in those last days, mainly through the letters and diaries of some courtiers and ambassadors present at Richmond Palace, paint a bleak and deeply moving picture. Elizabeth, the proud and once invincible Gloriana, refused with almost childlike obstinacy to keep to her bed, perhaps fearing that if she lay down, she would never get up again. For days and nights on end, she remained seated or reclining on a pile of cushions and pillows stacked on the floor of her chambers, in an uncomfortable and tiring position, immersed in a deep and melancholic silence, her gaze lost in the void, as if contemplating the ghosts of her long and eventful past, or the terrors of an uncertain future. She refused to eat, or barely touched her food, and her body, once upright and majestic, was visibly weakening and wasting away. Insomnia took hold of her, and she spent long nights awake, sighing, moaning softly, or according to some accounts, talking to herself, engaging in strange dialogues with absent or deceased characters. Her legendary mental acuity, sparkling wit, and iron will seemed to have vanished, giving way to deep apathy, unfathomable sadness, and at times, episodes of confusion or delirium. It is said that she complained of strange dreams and terrifying visions, that she saw ghosts in her room and felt a tightness in her chest that made it difficult to breathe. Her isolation from the outside world became almost total. She refused to receive most of her advisors, even those who had been her most loyal collaborators, such as Sir Robert Cecil, the son of her great minister Lord Burghley, who now bore the main burden of government. He distrusted doctors, whom he accused of wanting to poison him, or of being ignorant and incapable of alleviating his ailments, and he refused to take any medicine or remedy offered to him. Her legendary vanity, which had led her to take great care of her physical appearance and to use elaborate cosmetics and wigs for decades to hide the ravages of age and smallpox, seemed to abandon her in her final moments. She is described as having a gaunt face, sunken eyes, unkempt hair, and an expression of deep suffering and abandonment. The reactions of the court, her diminished family, as she had no direct descendants or close relatives in England, and the people of London to the Queen's imminent death were ones of enormous anticipation and contained fear. At court, rival factions were already beginning to move in the shadows, forging alliances and preparing for the power struggle that would inevitably ensue after the sovereign's demise. The question of succession, which Elizabeth had deliberately kept ambiguous throughout her reign, was now becoming pressing and dangerous. Everyone knew that the most likely candidate, and the one supported by Cecil and most of the council, was James VI of Scotland, son of Mary Stuart. But his official appointment had not yet been made, and there were other possible pretenders or factions who might try to take advantage of the power vacuum. The people of London, who for decades had cheered their queen and celebrated her victories, now awaited the outcome of her long illness with a mixture of sadness, fear, and curiosity. Religious processions and public prayers for her health were organized, but deep down, many sensed that the end of an era was near. The last desperate attempts to save the queen, or at least to obtain some clear indication of her wishes regarding her succession, took place in an atmosphere of growing anxiety and drama. Her closest advisors, especially the Archbishop of Canterbury, John Whitgift, and Sir Robert Cecil, repeatedly urged her to name her successor, to receive the comforts of religion, and to prepare herself in a Christian manner for death. Elizabeth, however, resisted. She clung to life with surprising tenacity and refused to talk about death or succession, perhaps for fear that if she named an heir, her own authority would vanish completely, or her life would be in even greater danger. For several days, according to witnesses, she lost her speech or refused to utter a word, communicating only through gestures or glances. The clock ticking toward her death moved forward relentlessly, and the tension in Richmond Palace was unbearable. Finally, on the afternoon of March 23rd, when it was clear that her strength was failing and the end was near, her advisers managed to obtain from her, through gestures, as she could barely speak, an apparent confirmation that she accepted James VI of Scotland as her successor. It was a crucial moment, which ensured a relatively peaceful transition of power, but it was also shrouded in ambiguity and controversy, as some doubted the Queen's full consciousness and will in that extreme state. The description of her physical and mental deterioration in those final hours is moving. The once powerful and energetic Elizabeth, reduced to a shadow of her former self, unable to speak, move, or make decisions, depending entirely on the will of her servants and advisers. All hope of recovery had vanished, and all that remained was to await the final outcome, contrasting the image of her former glory with the harsh and pathetic reality of her agony. The Queen, who had defied popes and kings, who had defeated the Spanish Armada, and who had personified the strength and cunning of power, now faced, alone and helpless, the only battle that no one can win. The last night of Elizabeth I, Queen of England and Ireland, which passed between the 23rd and 24th of March in the year of our Lord 1603, was a long and silent vigil in the sumptuous but now gloomy and oppressive apartments of Richmond Palace. The sovereign who for almost half a century had embodied the power, the glory, and cunning of Elizabethan England, the Virgin Queen who had symbolically married her kingdom, was now on the very threshold of death, her body consumed by old age and a relentless illness, her mind perhaps already clouded by delirium or plunged into the abyss of a deep and unfathomable melancholy. After several days of almost complete silence, during which she had refused to keep to her bed and had remained seated or reclining on cushions on the floor, resisting any medical treatment or human comfort, Elizabeth seemed to enter a state of stupor or semi-consciousness. Her faithful ladies-in-waiting, her closest advisers, such as Sir Robert Cecil, who hardly left her side, aware of the historical significance of the moment, and the Archbishop of Canterbury, John Whitgift, watched over her in silence, broken only by whispered prayers and the increasingly weak and spaced breathing of the dying queen. The atmosphere in the royal chamber must have been one of overwhelming solemnity, a mixture of anticipated mourning, political tension over the imminent succession, and a deep respect for the greatness of the figure who was passing away. There were, it seems, no great scenes of drama in those last hours, no grandiloquent words, no theatrical gestures. Elizabeth, the master of political performance, the queen who had known how to use her image and her words as weapons of state, now faced death with a kind of silent resignation, or perhaps simply with the extreme exhaustion of someone who has fought to the end and has no strength left. It is said that in one of her last moments of apparent lucidity, when Archbishop Whitgift reminded her of the great achievements of her reign and urged her to place her trust in God's mercy, Elizabeth squeezed his hand slightly, in a gesture that was interpreted as assent and spiritual peace. It is also said that, shortly before losing consciousness completely, she made a gesture with her hand towards her head, as if to indicate that the crown should pass to a king and not to a queen, which reinforced the interpretation that she had designated James VI of Scotland as her successor. But these are largely conjecture and self-serving accounts, passed down by those who had a direct interest in legitimizing the Stuart succession. Elizabeth's last words, if there were any coherent ones, have been lost in the mists of history or in the discretion of her witnesses. What does seem certain is that her death was relatively peaceful, with no apparent physical suffering in her final moments. She slowly faded away, like a candle burning down, until, in the early hours of March 24th, between 2 and 3 o'clock, according to most chroniclers, she breathed her last breath. He was 69 years old, a remarkable longevity for the time, and had reigned for 44 years and 4 months, one of the longest and most momentous reigns in the history of England. The exact moment of his death plunged the room into an even deeper silence, if that was possible. Those present knelt in prayer. Sir Robert Cecil, the man who had been her chief minister in recent years and who had worked secretly to ensure a peaceful transition of power, was charged with officially confirming the Queen's death and setting in motion the complex mechanism of succession. The immediate reaction of the courtiers was one of restrained but sincere mourning and enormous uncertainty about the future. The Elizabethan era, England's golden age, had come to an end. A new dynasty, the Stuarts of Scotland, was preparing to take the throne, and no one knew for sure what the new century and the new reign would bring. The revelation, or rather the official confirmation, of Elizabethan's death was made cautiously, to avoid any kind of disturbance or popular panic. But the news, as was inevitable, spread quickly throughout London and the kingdom, causing a wave of national mourning. The climax of her death, although devoid of the violence or drama of other royal endings we have explored, was no less significant or moving. It was the end of an exceptional sovereign, a woman who had marked an era and left an indelible mark on the history of her country and the world. Her lonely agony, in that palace on the banks of the Thames, surrounded by the ghosts of a reign without inner peace, but with undeniable outward glory, brought to a melancholy but also majestic close one of the most brilliant and fascinating chapters in the history of the English monarchy. The official announcement of Queen Elizabeth's death, although eagerly awaited in the last days of her illness, caused deep shock and a sense of irreparable loss throughout England and beyond. The Virgin Queen, Gloriana, the sovereign who had embodied the stability, strength, and pride of a nation for nearly half a century, was gone forever, and with her passed one of the most glorious and defining eras in English history. The immediate reaction at court, once death had been confirmed by Sir Robert Cecil and the royal physicians, was one of solemn mourning and feverish activity to ensure a peaceful transition of power. The Privy Council met urgently, and based on the supposed instructions of the Queen on her deathbed and prior agreements reached by Cecil, officially proclaimed James VI of Scotland as the new King of England, under the name James II. Messengers were sent in haste to Edinburgh to convey the news to the Scottish king and urge him to travel to London to assume his new crown. This proclamation, although generally welcomed as the most logical and least conflictive solution to the succession problem, was not without a certain melancholy and vague apprehension among many English people, who viewed with suspicion the arrival of a foreign king, a Scot, and from a different dynasty, the Stuarts, to succeed the last and much-loved Tudor. The people of London and all of England reacted with sincere and widespread mourning. Theatres were closed, festivities were suspended, and churches were filled with the faithful who came to pray for the soul of their late queen. For days, the bells of all the churches in the kingdom tolled in mourning, and sermons and elegies in honor of Elizabeth followed one after another. Her long life and successful reign had coincided with the birth of a strong English national consciousness, and many of her subjects saw her as the mother of the nation, the defender of the Protestant faith, and the architect of England's greatness in the world. Her death left a huge void and a sense of collective bereavement. The fate of Queen Elizabeth's body was the subject of the most elaborate and sumptuous funeral preparations. Her body was embalmed and dressed in rich royal finery. For several weeks it lay in state in a chapel at Whitehall Palace, where thousands of people, from the highest dignitaries to the humblest citizens, filed past to pay their last respects and see the face of their legendary sovereign for the last time, or rather, a wax effigy representing her as the embalmed body was rapidly deteriorating. The state funeral, held on April 28, 1603, was one of the grandest and most attended in English history. An impressive funeral procession, led by the kingdom's great nobles and followed by a huge crowd, accompanied the Queen's coffin from Whitehall to Westminster Abbey, the traditional burial place of English kings. There, after an emotional religious ceremony, Elizabeth was buried with full honors in the chapel of Henry VII, alongside her grandfather, the founder of the Tudor dynasty. Years later, her successor James I ordered a magnificent marble monument to be erected over her tomb, with a recumbent effigy of the Queen, which can still be seen today and has become one of the Abbey's main attractions. Paradoxically, James I also ordered the remains of his own mother, Mary Stuart, whom Elizabeth had had executed, to be moved from Peterborough Cathedral to a sumptuous tomb in the same chapel of Westminster Abbey, very close to that of her cousin and rival, thus uniting in death the two queens who had been so opposed in life. The immediate political consequences of Elizabeth's death were, above all, the personal union of the crowns of England and Scotland under a single sovereign, James III of England and VI of Scotland. This event, known as the Union of the Crowns, although it did not bring about a complete political union of the two kingdoms, which would retain their own parliaments and laws for another century, did mark a fundamental milestone in the history of Great Britain and laid the foundations for the future creation of the United Kingdom. The accession of James I to the English throne also meant a change of dynasty, from the Tudors to the Stuarts, and with it, a change in style of government and political priorities. James, a cultured man and theologian, but also dogmatic and unskilled in handling the complexities of English politics, would soon clash with Parliament and the constitutional traditions of the country, sowing the seeds of conflicts that would erupt violently during the reign of his son, Charles II, and lead to the English Civil War and the execution of a king. The power vacuum that could have followed the death of a queen without direct heirs was largely avoided thanks to the foresight of Sir Robert Cecil and the widespread acceptance of James Stuart as the legitimate successor. However, the transition was not without tensions and new uncertainties. What would the reign of the new Scottish king be like? Would he respect English institutions and traditions? Would he continue Elizabeth's religious policy? Or would he lean toward a more radical Protestantism, or worse still, toward a Catholic restoration? An unfounded fear, but one that was present in some circles. These questions and many others hung in the air, generating a mixture of hope and apprehension at the dawn of a new era. The death of Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, in the solitude of her palace in Richmond, was not simply the end of an exceptionally long and glorious reign. It was the closing of a fundamental chapter in the history of England and the beginning of a new era full of uncertainties and transformations. Her legacy, like that of all great figures who have left a profound mark on their time, is immense, complex, and has been subject to diverse and often conflicting interpretations over the centuries. Elizabeth Twirn inherited a kingdom divided by religion, threatened by powerful enemies, and with a precarious economy, and transformed it into a leading European power, proud of its national identity, its Protestant faith, and its growing maritime and commercial power. Her political skill, diplomatic astuteness, pragmatism, and ability to inspire loyalty and devotion in her subjects were legendary. She masterfully navigated the turbulent waters of European politics, keeping her enemies at bay, forging convenient alliances, and defending England's interests with iron determination. Her establishment of religion, although it did not satisfy everyone and created tensions with Catholics and Puritans, achieved a lasting compromise that defined the character of the Anglican Church and prevented England from plunging back into the bloody wars of religion that ravaged the continent. Under her reign, England experienced an extraordinary cultural flowering, the so-called Elizabethan Golden Age, which saw the genius of figures such as William Shakespeare, Christopher Marlowe, Edmund Spenser, and Francis Bacon, and laid the foundations of modern English literature and thought. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588, a crucial milestone in naval history and in England's assertion as a maritime power, became a symbol of the triumph of English Protestantism over Spanish Catholicism and of the ability of a small but determined nation to resist the most powerful empires. However, Elizabeth Twirn's legacy also has its shadows. Her refusal to marry and appoint a clear heir, although politically astute in many ways, plunged the kingdom into constant uncertainty over the succession and ultimately led to the end of the Tudor dynasty. Her religious policy, although pragmatic, was also repressive towards those who did not conform to the Anglican compromise, especially Catholics, who were subjected to harsh criminal laws and persecution. And her reign, despite the image of prosperity and merry England, also saw serious economic, social, and military problems, such as costly wars in Ireland, rural poverty, and social tensions. The moral or existential lesson to be drawn from the life and death of Elizabeth Twirn is perhaps that of the enormous personal price that the exercise of absolute power often demands. Elizabeth sacrificed her personal life, her chance of marriage and motherhood, for what she considered the good of her kingdom. She married England symbolically and devoted all her energy, intelligence, and life to its service. But this total devotion also condemned her to profound loneliness, especially in her later years, when she saw her dearest friends and advisors disappear and faced the prospect of death without the company of a husband or the comfort of a child to continue her line. Her lonely agony in Richmond Palace, surrounded by the ghosts of a reign without inner peace, but of undeniable outward glory, is a poignant reminder of human frailty even at the highest pinnacles of power, and of the melancholy that often accompanies greatness. The question that continues to echo through the centuries is whether Elizabeth's personal sacrifice was worth it, whether her virginity was a free and deliberate choice, or a necessity imposed by political circumstances, and whether her legacy of strength, independence, and cultural flourishing outweighs the shadows of her reign. Was she really the good Queen Bess that legend has made her out to be? Or was she a cunning and sometimes ruthless ruler who knew how to use her image and gender to stay in power in a world dominated by men? I invite you to share your own thoughts in the comments. What aspect of Elizabeth's life or legacy do you find most relevant or most controversial? And if these chronicles of the most shocking endings of royalty fascinate you and invite you to reflect, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, like us, and join us on our next journey through the enigmas and lessons that the past continues to offer us, continues to offer us, continues to offer us, continues to offer us, continues to offer us.